Gospel Pilgrim Cemetery is tucked in the woods off of 4th Street in East Athens. If it weren't for the large gate that marks the entrance, you could drive right by thinking it was just the forest. Upon entering the cemetery, it first looks just like a network of trails that you could hike on, but when you look closer, you can see that there are countless graves. Some are hard to see because they're distinguished only by a small metal marker, and some are clearly marked by headstones, but there are so many that if not walking on the path, it would be nearly impossible not to step on one. Frankly, it's not exactly what one would call pretty. There are no large monuments, and besides some benches and very few flowers, the graveyard is filled with only graves. It looks as though it was neglected for years. The graves are all overgrown, and many have sunken in, so it looks as though you could brush some dirt away and see the casket lying below. Many of the headstones are faded due to their age or broken. One has been completely broken off and turned upside down, leaning against a tree. The only graves that have flowers on them were the ones that can be seen from the road, as if to remind each passerby that the cemetery still remains. Those behind the gate look as though they haven't been touched in years. When I went to the cemetery, I was expecting an open area with orderly rows of headstones and flowers, and that's not what it's like at all. I think that could be part of the reason why it felt particularly creepy, but the fact that it is almost entirely concealed within a forest and seemingly desolate gives the area a spooky feel and made me feel uneasy to be there even in the middle of the day. Gospel Pilgrim Cemetery was founded during a time when a new type of cemetery was beginning to emerge. Prior to the 19th century, most people were buried in small graveyards owned by churches or actually inside of the church, depending on how much money they had. Over time, these sorts of mini cemeteries filled up, and many began to bury their dead in larger graveyards. These new cemeteries were much more pleasing to the eye and did not have an affiliation with religion. According to Keith Egner, a professor at the University of Missouri, these new cemeteries were created for the living, not the dead. The gravestones became more elaborate, and large memorials were built as a symbol of hope for those burying their loved one. The emergence of these huge cemeteries in the 1800s also showed the movement towards a more secular way of burying the dead. Instead of laying a loved one to rest on church property with hopes that it would get them into the afterlife, people started burying their dead in huge memorial parks where the sole purpose was to have a beautiful place to come back and visit someone that had died. During the same period, America was also going through the Civil War, which brought an end to slavery but a beginning to the Jim Crow era. While African Americans could no longer be seen as property, they weren't really seen as people either. So like many other things, cemeteries were segregated. African Americans were not allowed to be buried in the same cemeteries as whites. It wasn't until the late 1800s that African Americans began the move away from burying the dead in small church graveyards to actual cemeteries, like, for example, Gospel Pilgrim. It was founded in 1882 as a cemetery for African Americans by the Gospel Pilgrim Society, an organization that provided members with burial insurance, promising a proper funeral and burial when they died. Of the 3,500 graves in Gospel Pilgrim, very few of them are marked. Several historical figures were laid to rest here, including Madison Davis, a former slave who became a legislator, and Monroe Pink Morton, the owner of the famous Morton Theater in downtown Athens. Besides the large gate at the front of the cemetery, Gospel Pilgrim doesn't really have many of the physical characteristics that Keith Egner uses to describe this new type of cemetery created in the 19th century. This led me to the conclusion that because Gospel Pilgrim didn't exactly fit the criteria for a 19th century cemetery, it must have been forgotten. But upon looking closer, I realized that this isn't the case at all. Even though it seems like it has been abandoned, there's no trash in the cemetery, and the pathways are clear because there's a group dedicated to cleaning it regularly. There are people making sure that the cemetery looks the way it does, perhaps so people like me can visit it and experience it, how many did while people were still being buried there. Like with a lot of pieces of history, the goal of Gospel Pilgrim Cemetery is not to be an extravagant place that people visit because of its beauty. It's meant to be real, to help visitors imagine what it would have been like to not be able to bury a loved one somewhere because of the color of their skin, to help them feel the sadness and sorrow felt by the families and friends of all laid to rest here, to give them a citizen's perspective.